Welcome to the troubleshooting portion of the Glass Weld certification program. In the first portion of the troubleshooting section, we're going to talk about why you might lose your vacuum and how to address that. The first thing that we're going to check is if you ever lose your vacuum or notice that your vacuum is a little spongy or a little weak, is to just basically disassemble your injector and clean your seals, both your upper seal and your lower seal, and then re-lube them and reconnect your injector again. Test your vacuum at that point, and if the vacuum has not returned, we recommend that you replace all of the seals. At that point, your vacuum should in all likelihood return. Another reason why you might lose your vacuum is a buildup of resin on the outside portion of the lower chamber, so kind of on this lip right here where the white seal might sit. So what can you do to address that? Well, in addition to doing kind of your daily cleaning and using the wooden portion of your swab to prevent that from happening, if the buildup does occur, we recommend using ammonia and soaking the tip of the injector body in that ammonia overnight. That helps to eat away and kind of loosen up that buildup of resin, and then using something like the wooden swab again can help to break that excess resin away quite easily, and that should help to restore your vacuum. The next section in troubleshooting your repair equipment is in particular we're going to focus on your tripod stand, what things could go wrong there. The first thing that we want to address is just a reminder to always have the tripod stand in a Y shape over the repair. So you would never want it shaped in this direction or turned in this direction. And the reason once again is that if you were to have excessive suction cup sealant on one of your suction cups, it could drip down and contaminate your repair. Another thing to avoid when it comes to troubleshooting with your stand is when you're installing your stand against the glass, try not to press or push the stand against the glass. This can cause the crack to possibly spread. It also can lead to one or several of the suction cups not being fully adhered to the glass. And if you were to have some issue with the ratchet pawl, maybe it would be a little sticky consistently, then that would be something we would recommend you call customer service about. In the case of the EcoVac, you do have threads, and so it would be a good idea to regularly clean those threads because you could get a buildup of resin on those threads over time, and that could prevent having issues with your tripod stand for the EcoVac. In this portion of our troubleshooting section, we're going to analyze why you might get a grinding effect within the threads of your injector. So if you're noticing kind of a binding or grinding effect when you're using your injector, here's some things you can check for. The first thing is just to look to see if there's any debris in the threads of the injector itself. If so, you can clean those out with a little brush or with a little towel, just making sure you can kind of break free anything that's inside those threads. The other common factor is that your upper seal inside of the body of the injector may be swollen. If that's the case, then as you can imagine, the tolerances of the injector get kind of thrown out of whack, which can cause the threads to begin to grind. So if that's the case, if you notice that, probably one of the first things you'd want to do is to break apart the injector and replace your upper seal and see if that solves the grinding issue. If you've tried both of those things and that does not solve the problem, we would recommend you call our customer service team to get further help. In this portion, we're going to talk about how to prevent getting resin into the upper chamber of your injector and what that might cause if it does happen. The most common culprit for getting resin into the upper chamber is when you've loaded the resin in the injector, or maybe after repair you've got some leftover resin in the injector still, and maybe you've stored the injector on its side or even maybe possibly vertically. That could cause some resin to weep past the seals and get into the upper chamber. So what can happen if that does occur? Well, a couple of things. The upper seal here can get kind of excessively slick, which can cause a couple of detrimental effects. Probably the number one thing being that the handle may kind of pull downward automatically when it's on a vacuum cycle. So that's certainly something you would want to try to avoid. You can also check your threads to see if you have any lubricant or any resin in the threads itself, which can cause that kind of pull down effect as well. But how can you prevent that from occurring, or how can you address it when it comes up? Well, simply clean your seals, dry them out real well, relubricate your injector, put it back together. Always being mindful of the fact that excessive lubrication is really not your friend. You just need a small amount of lubricant, both on the upper seal, the lower seal with resin, and the upper chamber. And following those steps should prevent getting resin into the upper chamber. In this section of troubleshooting, we're going to talk about one common problem, which is the location of the resin when you load the resin in the tip of the injector. So ideally you want to have about maybe half an inch of space in the top of the injector in which to load the resin and then pop your white seal in. What can happen is if the resin is, or if the chamber is too far up, you don't have enough space to get 4 to 6 drops of resin in there. When you go to put the white seal in, you may just kind of get a squirt of resin, get your glove dirty, or spill it out over the tip of the injector. Alternatively, when you bring the resin up, that's also a key portion. Once you've loaded the resin in, you've put your white seal into the injector like so, and then you're bringing your resin up to the surface of that seal. You want to make sure that the resin only comes up to the lower surface of that seal, especially with the zoom. Since the zoom does create extra compression on that seal, if the resin is too far up on the seal, when you contact the glass, the resin might just weep down the glass, which is something you obviously want to avoid, because you'd have to take the injector off and reload the resin once again. And if the resin is too far back, then when you turn the injector upside down, when you're about to load it into the stand, the resin may come weeping out. So as long as you have the resin right about the lower portion of the inside of that seal, you should be just fine. In this section of troubleshooting, we want to talk about too much pressure against the glass and how that can occur with your injector. That certainly is a common problem, and that can cause a couple of detrimental effects to your repair. The first being that you may close up the repair, which will impede the flow of the resin. It can also cause kind of a spring-back effect when you remove the injector from the glass. You may end up with a little void directly under the impact or under where the injector was placed. So how can we prevent that? Well, if you're using the EcoVac, of course, it uses a threading system. So when you thread it down into the tripod stand, once you've contacted the glass, you want to turn the injector about 1/8 to 1/4 of a turn is all. You don't need much more than that or any more than that, otherwise you may create excessive pressure against the glass. Also, if you turn it way too far, you may even cause the crack to spread, so those are things you can try to avoid. However, the new ProVac Zoom that we introduced to the market recently was designed with this in mind specifically, to try to alleviate this super common problem. So as you can tell, the ProVac Zoom has those tiny ratchet teeth and the ratchet paw, so it's much simpler to get a proper seal against the glass. Once you contact the glass, you really just want 1 to 2 clicks. So you hear it kind of click once. If you have to press it hard, don't keep pressing. You never want to press the zoom from the top of the cap. Just grab it from the side and just click, click, click. Once it contacts the glass, 1 to 2 clicks is the maximum, and that should provide just the right amount of pressure to prevent closing the break up or causing that spring-back effect. In this portion of troubleshooting, we want to talk about flowering and how to avoid it. Well, the first question is, what is flowering? Flowering occurs when the resin kind of weeps into the polyvinyl butyrate around the perimeter of the break, creating kind of a line of distortion or a flower-looking effect. Of course, this is an undesirable effect during the repair process, and it can be caused by a variety of things. The first and probably most common culprit of creating flowering is heat. And this can be heat caused by the technician or heat caused by the environment. So how can we avoid that? Well, the first thing is, if it's a very, very warm day, let's say 90 degrees plus, use a thicker resin. Ideally, our warm weather resin, our 2020 resin, would be a better choice to help prevent flowering. And from a technician standpoint, dropping the technique of using heat from the inside of the windshield, which some technicians tend to do, we don't recommend that as even a first, second, or third alternative, only as a last resort. And certainly using excessive heat from the inside of the windshield can soften the polyvinyl butyrate and cause that flowering effect to occur. So from a practical standpoint, how can you avoid flowering? Well, if you're using the EcoVac injector, keep in mind that when you go to inject the resin into the break, you really only want to wait until the white seal just swells just slightly. Once you see that occur, don't continue to inject resin. Just let the resin flow naturally into the break. Excessive resin pressure can be responsible for flowering, especially on a warm day. Now when it comes to the zoom was designed with a much softer seal to allow for compression. but it also has the effect of helping to absorb excessive resin pressure, which greatly reduces the possibility of flowering. However, it is still possible to cause a flowering effect with the zoom if you were to apply excessive resin pressure. So again, once you see that resin or the white seal sort of swell up a little bit, stop your injection process, let the resin flow naturally into the brake, and that should help you to reduce the flowering effect in your repairs. In this portion of troubleshooting, we want to talk about how to resolve any time you may run into a brake that just seems like it won't fill. How can you address that? Well, there are a couple things we can kind of be as the first technique you would use. The first thing we would recommend is to use a massaging technique. Most glass weld kits include an included cork, where you can use any kind of real cork material, and just massage the glass from the inside, or the brake in particular, from the inside of the windshield for maybe 10 to 15 seconds directly behind the brake. This causes kind of a pumping action on the brake, flexing all of the legs simultaneously, and can really help to get the resin flowing within the brake, especially on a complex brake. The other technique is flexing, and as you've seen in some of our other videos, we do show using the fixed tip probe, both flexing before starting the brake to help open and connect any of the legs or fissures inside of the brake, as well as during the vacuum and during the injection cycle. So doing this can help to move the resin along, especially on a complex brake. The other thing that you might want to keep in mind is something we addressed in another one of our videos, but the injector being too tight against the glass. If the injector is too tight against the glass, you may have trouble getting the brake to fill. So if that's the case, one of the first things you can try is just kind of spinning your EcoVac off just slightly, loosening it just slightly. That may help to get the resin to flow. That's certainly something you could try. And with the ProVac Zoom, in that case, there is also a way to alleviate the pressure with this. If you feel like it's too tight, you can press the lever on the Z-mount stand and just kind of hold the ejector in while allowing it to kind of lift up one notch, and that could also help to alleviate excessive pressure against the brake. Now, what about drilling? Certainly drilling could occur from time to time if you get a brake that just won't fill. For us at Glassweld here, we consider drilling to be a last resort. If you've tried all these other things we've already mentioned, then you may want to pull your injector off, drill a small hole into the impact point, and then start the repair. But really, it would be a last resort. The one other possibility when it comes to your brakes not filling is that the brake may actually be on the inside of the windshield. It may appear to be on the outside of the windshield, but it may actually be on the inside. If it is on the inside, you can typically check that with a razor blade or a probe, kind of feeling if you can feel the edges of the crack or of the impact point on the inside of the windshield. And if you run into this type of brake, we recommend not repairing this particular type of damage. In this portion, we want to talk about potential curing issues or issues with your curing lights. The first thing you'd want to check if you're using a battery-powered light is just to check the batteries. The batteries may need to be replaced. If you're using the ProCure Plus or the Cure-All, checking your connections both on the cigarette lighter end as well as the connection port to the light itself to make sure things are tight and that there's no loose joints, for instance. Also, if you're using a battery pack power supply, checking to make sure that you have a minimum of at least 11 volts, which is necessary to ramp up the curing lights. In addition to that, it would be good to check the connections of the battery pack itself to make sure that there's no issues with the connection itself, or alternatively in the vehicle, if you are using the vehicle cigarette lighter port, to make sure that that port does not have some defect as well. Addressing these issues should solve any potential curing issues, but if it doesn't, please feel free to call customer service. In this section of troubleshooting, we want to talk about potential pit filler issues. Probably the most common pit fill issue is that when you go to apply the pit fill to the glass, you end up with a little air bubble behind the pit fill and directly in the impact point. So how can you avoid that? Well, a couple of things. Probably the first thing is to cut your film tab into 4s or even 8s. Creating a smaller piece of film tab can help to reduce this issue. The other thing is, if you do notice the air bubble right off the bat, just wipe it off, pull off the film tab, wipe it off, and reapply the film tab. However, if you've already cured it and then you notice the air bubble afterwards, not a big deal. You can always use the edge of a razor blade, kind of scrape out the impact point, the pit filled area, and then reapply the film tab, this time paying attention for any possible air bubbles right in the impact point. Another common issue for pit filling is when you apply the film tab to the glass, pressing that down can cause an indent in the glass, can cause an issue, especially if you kind of press it with your thumb or your finger, and that can lead to an indent in the glass, and then the wiper blades may have issues. So you really just want to lay the film tab over the pit fill area without pressing it down. Another thing to keep in mind is when it comes to scraping the pit fill. When you're using your razor blade, you certainly can start off a little bit aggressively, again at a 90-degree angle always, but when you get down to like the last little bit of that pit fill, you really want to go gently and softly so that you don't end up with a little scalloped edge around the impact point, around where the pit filler sits. And then lastly, when it comes to polishing your pit, there's a couple of techniques we recommend. Your kit includes a cork. If you do use a cork to polish the pit, make sure it's a true cork, not a synthetic cork, which will not give you the polish effect that you're looking for. But we have a lot of technicians that love to use just simply a rough, cheap, inexpensive paper towel, which provides a little extra sheen to the surface. Or even some technicians like to use the cardboard on the outside of their razor blades to get a nice shiny surface to finish off their pit.